Secretary of State, good morning. Give us the thinking behind this.
Good morning, Nick. We set up a task force back in May, and they reported this morning. One of their main recommendations is a new offence of pet abduction. There's been lots of debate about theft. When we think of theft, you think of property, you think of goods and chattels. These are living, sentient animals. We have a responsibility to them. The impact of their taking on the owner, and indeed on the animal itself, is significant. And that's why I think pet abduction really sums up the overall significance of this type of offending. And having a new offence, much more akin to an animal cruelty type of offence, I think is definitely the way to go.
You may be aware that your colleague Priti Patel, who did a phone-in with me at the beginning of the year, took a number of calls from LBC listeners who had suffered that. And one of the chilling things that the Home Secretary shared with me and my listeners, that you believed, or it was the belief at the time, that criminal gangs were actually involved in this. This wasn't just random opportunism. Do you now know that to be a fact, Secretary of State?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right. There is money to be made, sadly, from the taking of dogs in particular and their resale. And there is, I'm afraid, an underworld here relating to the selling of dogs, the passing off of dogs as pedigree dogs when in fact they've been bred in conditions of appalling cruelty. And indeed, in the report, you'll see a welcome reference to smaller operations, which at the moment go under the radar and aren't licensed or registered. We need to do more to really bring that type of abuse out into the open. And it's not just about, the end result, the crime and the sentence. It's about the punishment. It's about the detection and the prevention of this type of offending, which is why I think this end-to-end report is a really welcome contribution to policy development.
Share with my listeners the mechanics now, if you would, Lord Chancellor. How long does this take to, if you'll pardon the word, rumble its way through the various parliamentary stages?
Yeah, well, indeed, you're right, Nick. I mean, the good news is that I will be working at pace with my officials on drawing up the details of the offence. We have a number of options. We have the police and crime bill that I've talked to you about in the past going through Parliament at the moment. And indeed, there will be another piece of legislation on pets, kept animals. So we've got a number of options here. What I want to reassure listeners about is that we're going to get this done during this session of Parliament. And the session of Parliament will end in April of next year, all being well. And therefore, the sense of pace, I think, first of all, by the fact that the task force reported in only a few months, I think, is really something we've got to maintain now, bearing in mind the concerns that so many listeners have about this criminality.
You mentioned the task force. It comprises, obviously, your ministry, the Home Office and police departments, and DEFRA. Now, you probably know where I'm coming with this. DEFRA's had some unfortunate headlines over its handling of the case with Geronimo the alpaca. My understanding is that an independent vet isn't even allowed to witness, take part, or have a post-mortem of the alpaca. Is this true? And if so, why?
Well, look, I don't know the full details of the post-mortem process with regard to this particular process. What I do know is that whilst I think all of us have a natural concern and an empathy with the owner and indeed with the animal itself, there are wider issues relating to TB here that couldn't be ignored. Every day in our country, our farmers are losing some of their herds to TB. In fact, these are much loved animals. I know from my own local farmers how much the bond between the farmer and his animal is created, and the sense of loss and devastation caused by TB is a real one. And therefore, I think it was important that we had a coherent system here. I think that DEFRA really had no choice but to enforce the current system.
But my question was about the post-mortem. I hear what you're saying. And I mean, that is now, sadly, it's a debating point because, as you rightly say, Geronimo has been dispatched and that will forever be a point of debate. But as regards the post-mortem, you can understand that the owner is keen to allow an independent vet to assess it or even to take part in it. And also we're hearing it could be months before we hear the results of the post-mortem, Lord Chancellor. Why?
Okay, well, as I say, look, I'm not privy to the precise details. I'm hearing what you are raising about it. Clearly, it's in everybody's interest that we know the facts as soon as convenient. I'm sure that issue will be taken further forward, and the DEFRA colleagues will be able to come forward with their answers. But as I say, I think this particular case has, as you say, raised wider issues about the system and about the importance of making sure that we prevent TB from causing devastation to our herds.
All right. A couple of other areas while I have the benefit of you on the line, which actually across your path, a readiness possibly to crack down on the misuse of what's called nitrous oxide, or hippie crack as it's known colloquially. I know this is being driven obviously by your colleague Priti Patel, but you are the Justice Secretary. Can you give us any more details on that, Lord Chancellor?
Yes, Nick. The current position is that so-called laughing gas, nitrous oxide, to supply it is a criminal offence unless it's for particularly lawful purposes. What this particular review is all about is looking at whether or not possession itself should be criminalised, and the Independent Advisory Council will look at this matter. The reality is, in our communities up and down the country, we see the effects of it. We see the disused canisters in the gutter. We hear the stories about the effect on young people and the concern that parents and families have about the prevalence of the use of this particular substance. And that's why I think it's right that the Home Office called for this review today. We've got to make sure that the law is as robust and as up to speed as possible. Forgive that unintended pun, by the way, is up to pace as possible with regards to the use of psychoactive substances like this one. I'm a parent. We're all concerned to keep our kids safe. It's the right thing to do.
You mentioned you're a parent. You're far too young a man to have pre-teenage school age children. But were you to have, would you allow them to have the jab, Lord Chancellor?
Well, look, I think that's a question that parents are asking themselves.
And I just asked you.
Yeah, and look, I think I would. But that's why I think JCVI is right to go through the workings on this, to provide as much confidence as possible when it produces its findings to parents, to allow them to make an informed decision on behalf of their children. We're talking about people who are below the age of what we call Gillick competence, in the law, competence to make their own decisions. It's therefore vital that we give parents all that information so that they can make a decision that they feel confident about in the interests of their child.
Lastly, noting and reminding the listeners you tried and sadly you failed. How did you react when you heard that the double child rapist and killer Colin Pitchfork was a free man?
Well, I think all of us regard the crimes that he committed as some of the most despicable that we have ever heard about in our country. They sent a chill through the spine now, even thinking about it 35 years later. And all our thoughts with the surviving family who've been through hell and back on this. Pitchfork is now subject to some of the most stringent licence conditions ever imposed in our country. He's on a GPS tag. He's subject to regular lie detector tests as well. We will work very hard to make sure this individual, any risk that he poses, is kept to a minimum. But I know that's no consolation to the families concerned. Were this man sentenced now, Nick, he would of course have been subject to a whole life order.
And just explain to the listeners what that means. So, God forbid there was a modern day Pitchfork, he or even she would not get out. Explain why, Lord Chancellor.
Yeah. So the law was changed, and indeed I'm changing it further to make sure that people who commit the appalling act of murdering a single child the courts will start with the presumption that this person should stay in prison for the rest of their life. And I think those sort of changes mean that this particular scenario will not be repeated in future years. Having said that, I'm working very hard with officials on a root and branch review of the parole board itself. I'm looking very carefully at the overall operation. Independence is important. These decisions have to be made independently. But I think that there's more that can be done in order to increase public confidence that decisions are made in the best possible way and with all the necessary safeguards and safety valves to give the public that sense of confidence that the system is working properly.
We'll leave it there for now. I need to get to a news update. Thank you very much for your time. Robert Buckland, Lord Chancellor, Justice Secretary, appearing here on LBC, where the